All right, hello, all you headbangers out there. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk some metal. And tonight, in particular, we are going to be talking about Pentagram, one of the true godfathers of the entire doom metal genre. Looking back through the past videos I've posted on my channel so far, I haven't really done a lot of Doom content, which is a little bit surprising because it is one of my favorite styles of heavy metal. I've just done more videos on other topics, but it's definitely time to get a little Doom back in the mix. And what better band to cover than Pentagram? They're one of my favorite bands. They have a very deep catalog, and so we're going to go way, way down a rabbit hole tonight, going through all of their material. They've been around for a long time in different sort of forms with different lineups, and there's been some name changes, there's been lineup changes, there's a lot of bootleg material, there's a lot of old material that's never seen an official release. So we're going to be looking at all kinds of crazy stuff tonight. I'm not going to go through the whole band's history in terms of every lineup change or stuff like that. You know, Bobby Leibling's history is pretty well known and documented in other places on DVDs. We all know he's had a lot of demons in his life. Tonight we're just going to focus more on the music and what their recorded output is. A little background before I start going. I first heard Pentagram in the early to mid 90s. They were a band I had heard of and I was interested in checking out, but I couldn't find any of their material for a while. And then the guy who used to take care of Mad Hatter Records up in northwestern Ohio, his name was Jim, super nice guy. One day, somebody brought in a copy of the first Pentagram LP to sell or trade in, and Jim slipped it behind the counter rather than putting it out on the racks right away because he knew it was something I would be interested in. He also knew he wouldn't have to wait more than a couple of days before I'd be coming back to the store because I always stopped by at least a couple of times a week. And yeah, he showed that to me. I freaked out. He sold it to me for a pretty reasonable price and instantly fell in love with it as soon as the needle hit those grooves. This was not an album that I had to warm up to or had to grow or anything like that. No, no, no. This was an ass kicker from the get-go. And from there, I got more and more interested in tracking down the band's other material. And as I mentioned before, a lot of their material never got a proper release. So if you become a real Ram fan, you've got to be willing to get deep into tape trading circles, trading live shows. I was active here and there on different Pentagram fan forums for a while. So yeah, it's hard to track a lot of that stuff down, but there's a really rich body of work there if you can dig into it. So without further ado, let's check some stuff out. Pentagram, some of the members trace their roots all the way back to the late 1960s. These guys were there at the inception of heavy metal. About the time Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin were getting warmed up. You had some of the band members in an act called Shades of Darkness, and they did record at least one demo of material. I've just got it on a little bootleg CDR, but the Shades of Darkness material is mostly just cover songs. You've got covers on here by bands like Cream, Iron Butterfly, Jimi Hendrix, Free, all stuff that you would, very much expect from bands that are interested in heavy music at that time. And, these guys were very much into that scene. Bobby Leibling is famous for advocating for a lot of those early underground heavy bands, acts like Groundhogs, Sir Lord Baltimore, Bang. Famously, he's always been a huge fan of Blue Cheer. It's why you always see the words, and of course, Blue Cheer in the thank you part of the liner notes on Pentagram albums. Bobby still always adds that. And as just a random little tangent, when I was writing my dissertation in graduate school, on my acknowledgments page where you thank like your professors and your family for supporting you and all that stuff, at the very bottom I also put ... and of course Blue Cheer, because I always thought that was a cool little shout out and figured I want to slip it in here because trust me, when you're writing a dissertation, sometimes you gotta make your own fun, and it amuses me to no end that it's included there in this geology dissertation on fossil geochemistry and stable isotope work, that you have this little shout out to Blue Cheer in there. But let's get back on track. So yeah, you had some very early recordings. Bobby also did. There's a one-song demo he did on here in 1970 for a song called "Back into the Ground." So recordings were getting done early as demos and such. But Bobby would start to line up with other guys and other musicians, and Pentagram would take shape in the early 1970s. They did go through some different name changes in those early years. For example, one of the early names that they worked under and recorded some material with was Stone Bunny. It's probably a good thing they ditched that moniker and moved on to Pentagram. I'm going to go out here on a limb and say they would not have the same legendary cult status they do if they'd stuck to the Stone Bunny name, because that's a hard one to swallow. All right. There's a lot of Stone Bunny material has been circulated from some demos. Again, a couple of bootleg discs here. With a lot of these bootlegs, you do have to be careful about the dates that are posted on them. These are labeled Stone Bunny 1970 and 1971. It's kind of hard to know for certain if those dates are accurate or not. For my money, a lot of the material from these early demo and rehearsal sessions under the Stone Bunny name is not particularly interesting. They make for a good historical artifact, showcasing what the band was doing in their early forms, but a lot of these songs, I don't find them particularly good. They're not very tight. A lot of them are not particularly heavy even. So this is not the material that really interests me the most in the Ram catalog. Moving forward, they went to the name Macabre, which is a much better name. Let's face it, just about anything would have been a step up from Stone Bunny. And under the Macabre name, they did release their first physical product, which was a 7-inch single. This is a reissue that Relapse did a few years ago. It has the songs Be Forewarned and Lazy Lady. It's a really good pair of tracks. Be Forewarned has a cool strumming guitar sound. It's kind of got a dark, ominous vibe to it. This version of Lazy Lady is a really strong one as well. So the band was, really starting to gel and hit their stride by this point. Now, the original copies of the Macabre 7-inch have an interesting little bit of lore associated with them. The original pressing of 1,000 copies had the band's name spelled wrong. So this is one of the originals, and if I can get it to show up with there, you'll notice that it doesn't say macabre, it says Macbri. They kind of left one of the A's out. Now, if your band is named Macabre, that's kind of spooky, dark, and occult, and mysterious. Exactly what you're going for with a lot of this kind of early 70s hard rock and heavy metal stuff. On the other hand, if your band's name is Macbri, it makes you sound Scottish, like you're going to be playing a bunch of folk instruments at the next Highlands Festival or something. So, oops, a little bit of a problem there. Reportedly, about half the copies were trashed because of the error, and a second pressing was done that had the band's name spelled correctly on it. So they looks the same 2 songs, but just without the typo. So here's one of the second pressings of the original single, and you can see that now, yes, you've got the spelling corrected, and the band is recognized appropriately as Macabre. You would think that the original pressing with the typo would be the harder one to track down, since allegedly half the copies were destroyed. In my limited experience of tracking down Pentagram records and dealing with collectors, I've always come across more copies of the misspelled version than the correctly spelled version. I don't know why that is. Again, it's a small sample size, but I've seen a lot more of the misprints than I have the correct one. But either way, it's a good single, good way to kind of, start getting some physical product out there. It's a good start to their career for sure. And, they would kind of go from strength to strength. The next year, 1973, they'd get their next single out. It's on this very distinct purple label, on a label called Bafo Sako Records. I can dig it, sure. It's got a good pair of tunes on it with Hurricane and Earth Flight, 2 very good numbers by the band. And so again, by this point, they're firing on all cylinders pretty good. The lineup in this version of Pentagram is Bobby on vocals, of course. You've got Vince McAllister, who's a very strong guitar player, Greg Main on bass, and Jeff O'Keefe on drums. And Just Name comes up a few times in the later history of the band, so we'll get there. In 74, the band would release another 7-inch single, although this one was really just made for promotional purposes. It has a kind of light orange label to it. Not a whole lot else on the label, which seems a little weird at first. The deal with this single was that since it was really just being sent out to radio stations and labels and stuff to try to drum up some interest in the band, they just used a normal ink stamp and would stamp like the band's name and like song titles and just a quick credit on the labels. So they would just have very simple stamped labels, and those were the ones that got sent out. The unstamped copies reportedly are the copies the band just either kept for themselves or gave to family and friends. This particular copy came from one of the guys who was helping manage the band around 1974, and he's the one who relayed that story about, the unstamped copies are the ones that we just kept and handed out for free. This is a good single too. It features a cover of the Rolling Stones' Under My Thumb, which they do a good job on. And then it also features an early version of one of their classics, which is called When the Screams Come. So another good single, but didn't really, get the band moving forward in terms of more traction, sad to say. So you get into the mid-70s, and the band was experiencing some issues. They weren't really getting any traction. Bobby's drug habits were reportedly causing a lot of issues with the band as well. And so there's a time where Pentagram kind of falls apart, and some of the members rebuild. And eventually, Bobby's kind of gets back into the band. They work with the second guitarist for a period of time. So you kind of have like a little break in the action, and then you have them move forward with a slightly revamped lineup. So this is where we switch over to some of the bootleg and unofficial stuff. And again, a lot of these are things that have never gotten any kind of proper release. This little collection, a couple of bootleg CDRs, has some rehearsals that the band recorded in the early 70s, specifically in December of 1973. And one of these two was recorded on Bobby's birthday. These have surprisingly decent sound quality for bands just jamming in the rehearsal space. They also tend to include songs that never made it onto any other official Pentagram recording. So again, if you want to hear all of the tracks that the band laid down, you have to get into these kind of rehearsal recordings to track some of those down. And they did lots of other various types of live recordings over time as well. Just another, couple of CDRs here with different live shows, some of them as early as 74. It has some rehearsals. There's a live set from 1976 when the band was kind of in that revamp lineup. And it has some other live shows too from much later in the band's existence. Now, again, with these kind of bootlegs, you got to be very careful about the names and dates on them. For example, these two are labeled as being demos under the name Macabre in 72, Virgin Death in 73, and the other disc is labeled Wicked Angel in 1974. And these are other names the band did use for very brief periods of time. They were briefly known as Virgin Death and also as Wicked Angel, but they didn't really function under those names for very long. So it's a little weird to have the demos labeled that way. And again, the dates can be a little misleading on these too. For example, most of the tracks on this one labeled as Wicked Angel 74, as far as I can tell, a lot of those are actually from 1973 recording sessions, not 74. So be very careful picking up these kind of boots. They're very simple in packaging. There's a few pictures on the booklet, but there's really no liner notes or anything like that with them. Simple disc design. The sound quality varies a lot, and it depends on the tapes they're coming from. Some of the early rehearsal things are pretty rough sounding. They did have some early rehearsals that were sort of properly recorded at bigger studios. So if you're looking for these kind of things, and I'll point it out on this next set, there's some specific recordings you want to look for. This was another unofficial series called Pentagram 1972 to 1979, which features a lot of various recordings from throughout their 70s run. There was always a little debate about whether these were official releases or not. Some people maintained that Bobby had given permission for these to be released. Other people said Bobby didn't have the rights to the material, so he couldn't, give permission. Okay, whatever. But again, these were pretty cheaply done. One thing that happened to a lot of copies, including mine, they were pressing them and slapping them in the case so fast that the ink hadn't dried, and so you'd end up with like the booklet getting stuck to the disc and tearing. Pretty shoddy operation there, you got to admit. These two volumes, though, do have some of the better sounding recordings in terms of sound quality on them. And some of the things that you want to look for if you're looking at Pentagram collections. The band did a session at Bias Studios in 1973, and those tracks have pretty good sound quality to them. Similarly, they did a session at the National Sound Warehouse in 1974, which also has pretty good sound quality to it and good track selection. And finally, that revamped lineup from around 76 did a session in the Columbia Studios, and that has good sound quality. So if you find some of these collection things, again, you always got to be a little careful making these kind of purchases, but those are some of the recording sessions you want to see credited on one of these collections before you decide to, pay your hard-earned money for them. If you really want to check out a lot of the band's 70s output, especially the early and mid-70s stuff, there are some more official releases you can get. This one came out in the late 90s. I think it was made in Canada. It's called Human Hurricane. This was another one. There was a little bit of questioning whether this was legit or not. It seemed like maybe Bobby, again, had signed off on the project, but others had not. But this was one, it was hard to track down at the time, and I guess still is, but this was a chance for people to hear some of these early recordings that previously had only been available in the tape trading community. The sound quality on a lot of these is not spectacular, so unless you're a really diehard fan, it's not one I can recommend you pay a lot of money for or spend a lot of time tracking down, really. A much better way to check out their early material is on the Relapse compilations, First Days Here and First Days Here Too. First Days Here came out around 2002. Let me double check that real quick. Let's see, First Days Here, yes, came out in 2002. And this was the collection that really got people interested in that vintage 70s era Pentagram material. Until this point, most people only knew the band as an 80s kind of doom metal band. But yeah, they'd had this entire decade of recordings before that, unless you had collected these old 7-inch records or gotten into the tape trading stuff or live shows, you had never heard any of that stuff. But Relapse did a nice job with this. They made a smart move and got in contact with Jeff O'Keefe, the band's drummer, throughout these early versions. And Jeff obviously has his head together. He kept himself in good shape over the years. He has got a very, good recollections, very clear on what kind of things happened and didn't happen, when things were recorded and such. So the liner notes on here are very extensive and very interesting to read. And Jeff clears up a lot of things about the band. He lays to rest a lot of myths about the band that had, popped up in other interviews and just saying like, no, that story is completely made up. Don't believe that. I have no idea where that idea came from. So yeah, the First Days Here 2 collection is really good. The second volume came out in 2006. It's also got a lot of good material on it. One little thing to note about this is one of the two discs is a lot shorter than the other. And so you kind of get the sense that by this point, Relapse was kind of scraping around for enough material that had decent enough sound quality to put out on a big commercial release. Again, the band had all these other rehearsals and demo recordings from back in the day, but sometimes the sound quality is not good enough that you're going to want to press it up on a major label. All right, so where are we? We're in the mid-70s. The band did some of that stuff like the Columbia Studios demo session. But again, it didn't really work out. And there's another incarnation of the band in the late 70s. And they put out one more vinyl product. So this was the last of their 70s singles. This one came out in 1979 on the High Voltage label. It's a really good single. It has two of their classic tracks. You've got a new version of When the Screams Come, and you've also got the iconic Living in a Ram's Head on it. Now, with this single, you sometimes see copies in picture sleeves. They have like a photo of the band on it. The picture sleeves are not legit. This was not issued with the picture sleeve back in the day. A collector made those sleeves years later and would circulate them to folks that had copies of the single. I've always heard it was somebody in Europe that made those up and kind of got them into circulation. But if you see it with a picture sleeve, it's kind of cool, but it's not an original artifact. It was added, to original copies of the single much, much later. So yeah, by the end of the 70s, this version of the band, they're sounding a bit more forceful, a bit more powerful. A lot of that early 70s stuff, in case I didn't point it out before, the band was operating very much in the space that things like Sir Lord Baltimore were working on. The band was never as heavy as Black Sabbath, really, but they also were never as bluesy as bands like Led Zeppelin tended to be. They kind of occupied a nice in-between space. They're very much what you'd expect, sort of the archetypical early to mid 70s hard rock to metal sound was going to be like. Guitar driven, no organs, no flutes, none of that kind of stuff. Just, good, solid, heavy music. There's not a lot of material from that late 70s period of Pentagram that's been preserved. You've got the one single. There was a live show that was pressed up on Black Widow Records years later called A Keg Full of Dynamite, which gives you a glimpse into the band around this time. And it's nice because this does include the 2 tracks from the 7-inch as bonus tracks. So you can check that out without having to track down an original. I've only got 1 or 2 other live shows from this era. There's this boot, which is titled Live in Spotsylvania 1978, which has, again, sound quality is not great. But yeah, I used to have some guys here, Bobby's working, with sort of a different lineup, by the end of the 70s, trying to make one more go of it, but it didn't really pan out. All right, now that could very easily have been the end of the 70s catalog. One last thing to show here before moving on. There have been some other reissues in more recent years of a lot of the 70s material. This is one that's called If the Winds Would Change. And again, it just kind of includes selections from some of their earlier stuff. I've never played this one very much. I was excited when it came out, but when I heard it, I felt like the sound quality wasn't really up to par. The track selection could have been a little stronger. So yeah, this is one that I kind of put it on the shelf and don't really revisit it a whole lot. But there are some other collections that you can get that feature a lot of the earlier Pentagram stuff too. So yeah, by the dawn of the 1980s, Pentagram's kind of over and done with, and probably very easily could have become just a footnote in the history of 70s heavy metal and hard rock. However, in the earliest 80s, things started occurring elsewhere that would lead to a Pentagram revival. You had a guitarist out of Tennessee named Victor Griffin, and he was developing a very heavy sound. He and a buddy took off, left Tennessee for sort of the big city on the East Coast, and put together a band called Death Row. And Death Row's material has been documented. There's going to be some Death Row stuff to show here too. But there's this nice 2 CD set that has a lot of their early recordings on it. And as things, played out, Victor's buddy eventually went back to Tennessee. He was not in the band very long. So Victor ended up working with Joe Hasselvander, a drummer who's been known from different projects. Marty Sweeney, who's credited on, some of the late 70s Pentagram stuff. And eventually Bobby ended up in the band as the vocalist again. So there are the guys chilling on the back cover here. There's been different accounts of Bobby's inclusion in the band, and I feel like some people's accounts and interviews have also changed over time, so that it's hard to really figure out what was and wasn't going on. Some interviews, band members have said they were very reluctant to add Bobby because they knew of his problems, and his habits when in Pentagram. But they were kind of desperate for a vocalist. Others have said that it was a little more amicable than that. So again, take it for what you will. But regardless, by sort of the end of 81 into 82, Death Row is an operational unit, and they're playing live. They're working on their chops, and they're playing what you would consider more of an 80s style heavy metal with a very doomy sound to it. This is not retro 70s rock stuff. They're not going back to the Pentagram sound. Victor's famous for having this very low, evil sounding guitar tuning. I'm not a musician. I don't know all the terminology that well. He always refers to it as being tuned down to A, I think, maybe A flat, I don't remember. But regardless, he has a very distinctive tone to his guitar playing. And so, Death Row started rehearsing, doing demos and stuff. And this has been documented on other recordings too. There was a vinyl output around, now this didn't come out until about 2000. That records some of the band's tracks. Mostly, it says Death is Alive 1981 to 1985. If I remember right, most of the tracks on here are recorded from around 1983. And again, this is one that was really interesting when it came out, but doesn't have the best sound quality. It's not one I take off the shelf very often. When I'm wanting to hear Death Row, I'll pick other stuff. The band was also playing a lot of live shows, especially like in the Northern Virginia and DC, greater DC area, up into the New York area. And a lot of those shows have been circulated as well. This has, a couple of CDRs worth of live recordings, one show from 1982 and another one from 1983. A lot of shows in places like Maryland. One thing you have to watch with these Death Row live shows that I've figured out over time is that one show will exist under several different titles. Bootleggers don't always pay a lot of attention to the details, and sometimes they're being particularly unscrupulous, and they'll intentionally put a different label on a show, or they'll chop certain songs off of a show to make it look like it's got a different track list and a different length, so that you're like, oh, I don't have that one. It's got more songs than what my version has. But then you play them side to side and realize, this is the same thing, just with 2 extra songs. A good example of this that I've just worked out in the past year or so with a fellow Pentagram fanatic out on the West Coast, Rob. Rob and I both have digital versions of a live show from Knoxville in, it's either 82 or 83. But my version has more tracks than Rob's does. It's the same show, but it's just that in the middle of Rob's show, someone had cut out a couple of the tracks. And we came to find out that another Pentagram collector I believe in Germany, has another version of that same Knoxville show that's longer than mine. So even mine doesn't have the full set list from the night. And when you listen really closely, you can tell there's a couple places where, there's a little change in the audio where someone had snipped that track out at one point. And again, sometimes that's done to deliberately deceive people into thinking it's a different show. Some of that may have been done for more benign reasons back in the day. When you were doing tape trading stuff and you're trying to cram something onto one side of a 60-minute blank tape, well, you've got 30 minutes to work with. You may have to chop some songs off the show. If you were recording on a 90-minute tape or 120-minute tape, you might have time to get the whole show onto one side of the cassette. And then, those chopped versions, you make a copy for your buddies and your buddies make a copy for somebody else. And it doesn't take long before people have no idea that they're hearing a very abbreviated version of the concert. So it's something to be very mindful of if you get into wanting to hear all these early versions of Death Row songs. They were sounding really tight. A lot of them have very strong set lists. Sound quality, of course, will vary from one to another. But this was laying the groundwork and getting the songs worked out for what would become a lot of the classic Pentagram tracks moving forward. And so how did Death Row end up morphing into Pentagram? That has always been a bit of a point of contention with band members. So they had a Death Row demo of full-length material called All Your Sins. They got a deal with the label, and it was supposed to be pressed up that way. But when it came back from the pressing plant, you had this, their first debut album, but it had the name Pentagram on the cover. The band had not been operating under the name Pentagram at all. This came out in 1985. This is the record I got at Mad Hatter Records back there in the mid-90s. And this was reportedly a real shock to most of the band members. They're like, what the hell? We've been playing and gigging as Death Row for like 4 years now. We've never used the name Pentagram. Why is that on the cover? And accounts of what happened vary a little bit. A lot of folks have said that Bobby kind of went behind their back and told the record label, oh, by the way, we just changed your name to Pentagram, so you've got to have that on the cover instead of Death Row. Other people have said that the record label made the decision to ditch the Death Row name and put Pentagram on the cover instead. Don't know which is the truth, but the end result is the band got rechristened as Pentagram, more or less without most of the band members' consent. Because at that point, what are you going to do? Go out and tour for an album calling yourselves Death Row when the album has the name Pentagram on it? That's going to confuse the hell out of people, and you're not going to sell many records. So Pentagram it was. And this is kind of what's known then as the Death Row era of Pentagram, because they really should have been known as Death Row. So yeah, this is the original album. I always like the picture on the back, the cool red filter, guys hanging out, looking pretty evil and badass. And it is a killer album, one of my favorites of all time. Starts off right away on side one with a 1-2 punch of Relentless and Sign of the Wolf. And if you don't love the band by the time those two songs are done, go buy some Justin Bieber records. I can't help you. You're in the wrong place. I mean, if folks don't dig it, that's cool. But for me, this is outstanding material. Very high energy, very forceful. It's got this very doomy sound, but it's not slow and draggy doom material like you might think of with Candlemass or, St. Vitus sometimes. Yeah, this, is pretty powerful, strong stuff, just with this very bottom-heavy sound to it. So classic album, seminal album. It's been reissued a lot of times. The cover there obviously leaves a lot to the imagination. So the reissues typically look like this. And this was reissued as early as maybe 1989. Let me double check here. Got my notes pulled up on the side. But yeah, you had, by 93, you had reissues showing up with the title Relentless on them and, the more iconic Pentagram logo on the cover. These reissues tend to change a couple of things, though, too. They change the track order around. So on these, it allegedly goes back and uses the original track listing that the Death Row demo tape had, where it starts off with the song Death Row and then goes to All Your Sins, etc. So it doesn't have Relentless and Sign of the Wolf up front. Little historical notes to point out. Both versions do end with a song called 20 Bucks Spin, which it was from Bobby's old 70s Pentagram catalog. And so if anyone's ever kind of wondered about the name of the current record label that puts out a lot of death metal good stuff, yeah, the name actually traces back to the Pentagram album. And some of the earliest stuff on 20 Bucks Spin were Pentagram related recordings, if I remember right. So yeah, they were obviously fans and had some connections to the band Pentagram. So yeah, this is what most copies of the first album are going to look like and sound like. Another little change is that I am pretty sure most reissues, they went back and tinkered with the drum sound. Probably Hasselvander got back in there, and the drums sound a lot louder and more powerful, as I recall, compared to the original. All right, so the band is now called Pentagram. They march forward. They get their next album out 2 years later in 1987, and it's this one, which is called Day of Reckoning. So, hey, they get a real piece of cover art this time. Cool. Day of Reckoning is a pretty good album. I don't have a lot to say about it. I feel like it always, unfortunately for it, lives in the shadow of the debut album. But still strong. You have a little bit of a lineup change here. Some of the drums are done by Stuart Rose, so Hasselvander was leaving the band at this point, but is still credited with drums on some of these tracks, as I recall. The album feels a little short because it's only got 7 tracks on it. Side 2 has some good ones with Burning Savior and Evil Seed. Wartime is a very long song, which is why it kind of eats up a lot of time on side 2. So yeah, it's not a bad album at all. It just doesn't quite, it doesn't hold the, it's a distant second to the debut, but it is still a decent album in its own right. It also has an updated version of When the Screams Come, so revisiting that again. And that's something you tend to see on all the Pentagram albums is they have new material, but there always tends to be at least a few tracks that are from the band's 70s catalog that Bobby takes and the band sort of revamps them to sound more modern and up to date. So yeah, Day of Reckoning, worth checking out. It's a solid enough album, but you definitely want to check out the self-titled first. I think I've made that point pretty clear. All right. Band didn't have much come out for a few years after that, but in 1983, they did have, or sorry, I think I said 83, 1993, they have another album come out. Actually, it's credited in 94, my apologies. In 94, they released the album Be Forewarned. Kind of weird cover art here with a blurry vampire thing going on. This is a reissue. The originals on vinyl are really hard to find. I mean, being 1994, vinyl was as dead as it could get. I'm surprised it even got issued on vinyl at all in 1994. But yeah, the band was back, and it's a good album. Has a lot of really strong tracks on it. It's got a really heavy production, really sort of emphasizes that bottom heavy tone of Victor Griffin and company. A lot of songs on here that I love. Some of them, I've heard some people complain that they almost are maybe a little too simple or sound a little cheesy at times, but stuff like Vampire Love, Too Late is great. The opener, Live Free and Burn, is just crushingly heavy. It's a very good album. Now, I would say it's a little long. They probably could have trimmed a couple of the weaker tracks off of here and had a much tighter album, but it is what it is. And there are a few songs that date again back to the 70s catalog that got, the update treatment. This is when it got very little fanfare when it came out. In fact, I didn't know this album even existed until several years after its release. When, chatting with folks on different message boards, somebody mentioned the album. I was just like, wait, what? Huh? This was pre-Metal Archive, so you just didn't go look these things up easily like you can now. And so, yeah, I got it. I didn't really care for it much. I'm just like, I didn't know that existed. I guess I need to find that. He's like, oh, well, here, I'll just mail you my copy. I really don't like it. And so, yeah, this is the CD that some random dude on one of the Pentagram forums sent me way back. That would have been probably tail end of the 90s. So thank you very much. Still like it. Really good album, in my opinion. But it's also where the band was pretty much running out of gas by this point. The mid 90s, not the kindest time to the doom subgenre. Heavy metal was very much all about death metal and black metal on the heels of that. Doom didn't really get its revival until a few years later. The band did do some more demo stuff along the way. There's a demo on this bootleg that's credited to 1996. It has here Bobby working with Joe Hasselvander again and a couple of different guys trying out a few tracks, but it didn't really get anything. Victor Griffin, famously had sort of found religion and moved on to form Place of Skulls, which again a heavy band but had a Christian theme to it. So yeah, Pentagram felt like it had sort of reached a conclusion. But when you live in that ram's head, it's hard to move out sometimes. And so it'd be a few years later, Pentagram would show up once again. And 1999 saw the release of an album called Review Your Choices. Just double checking the dates here. Again, it's easy to get these tripped up. But yeah, and this was on Black Widow Records. And it's just Bobby and Joel Hasselvander working together. And this one got a lot of eyeballs back on Pentagram. I think a big part of that was it's a good record. It's got a very heavy sound to it. Bobby sounds really depraved on vocals. They got a really good, heavy, punchy sound to it. It has, again, some old tracks getting reworked, like Burning Rays. It's got some new stuff that's really good, like Gorgon Slave. But what also helped kind of boost this album, I think, was that it got really good coverage in Metal Maniacs, which, of course, was, oh, excuse me. Metal Maniacs was, of course, one of the leading heavy metal publications that was widely available at that time. And Jeff Wagner did an interview. I'm pretty sure he got to talk with both guys, both Bobby and Joe, about the album. So it was a really interesting interview, kind of, delved into the band's history some. This was a lot of people's first chance to figure out, like, oh, this band existed long before, the 1985 album came out and, had all these other songs and stuff. Bobby talked a lot about, their 70s career and stories and, shouting out some of those other bands. So this really kind of helped start the wheels moving forward on getting people more interested in that early 70s, what we think of now as, the godfathers of, doom and stoner metal and stuff like that. But yeah, it's also just a really, really good album. And so Bobby and Joe would follow up on the success of that a couple of years later with their next album, also on Black Widow, called Sub-Basement. Now, this one is not as strong as Review Your Choices. There's some issues here. You're starting out with a weird title and a very weird cover. Is this a ghost? Is this an old man yelling at a cloud? It looks more like an old man made of clouds yelling at some pipes in the ceiling, which I guess is in the ceiling of the basement, or I guess they're in the sub-basement. I don't know what to make of this, but I never thought it was a particularly good cover. The album starts out really strong. It's got a nice opening 1-2 punch with Bloodlust and Buzzsaw, but some of the tracks after that are a little hit or miss. And again, they're still relying on reworking some of the classic 70s Pentagram tunes. But in that 70s catalog, there are a lot of excellent tracks, but there were also a lot of sort of throwaway tracks, things that never would have gotten onto an album. If Pentagram had released a full-length album in 74, a lot of those songs clearly were not ready for release and never should have been. And so, yeah, they're reworking some things here too that don't really do a lot for me. So this one's a little bit more of a hit or miss affair, in my opinion. Not the first thing I reach for when I want to hear Pentagram. But, and again, being on Black Widow, these weren't always easy to track down in the United States, pre-Amazon and such. But not a bad album, but it also led to another point where the band, stumbled and fell on its face again. Hasselvander reportedly got pretty fed up dealing with Bobby at live shows. Bobby has, a long documented reputation for missing shows, showing up to shows in no condition to perform, things like that, or being extremely late for the shows, and maybe he's ready to go, maybe he's not. And Hasselvander just got fed up with it and walked away from the project. And so again, you kind of feel like maybe things now have run their course. But they hadn't fully run their course. Bobby would bounce back and do another album for Black Widow. This one came out in 2004. It's called Show 'Em How. Not the greatest cover, but I'll take it over Old Cloud Man yelling at the pipes any day of the week. And on this outing, Bobby's got, completely different musicians that are backing him up. And I'm double checking. I seem to remember these guys, were in bands of their own. Yeah, it's like Kelly Carmichael and company. So, they had their own acts going on, but they were, Pentagram fans. They were sort of helping Bobby out. But you feel at this point, it very much is sort of, Bobby getting some stuff recorded and finding some guys to help back him up on it. It's not the strongest track list, to be honest. There's some good ones on here, like Wheel of Fortune. The closing one is a really nice version of Last Days Here, which is one of their sort of best songs from back in the 70s, and it's the first time that Bobby had redone that one. But yeah, some of the other ones on here, the tracks like If the Winds Would Change is one I never cared for in their 70s collection. Catwalk is okay, but not their strongest. It does have a version of Star Lady, which was another one of their bigger sort of, yeah, now that's a track that could have been on a 70s, hard rock album and done pretty well. So I haven't played this in years. It's very much one that's just part of the collection. Pentagram's one of the very few bands I even pretend to be completist about. And there's a lot of Pentagram stuff I don't have. But yeah, I keep this one around because it's Pentagram, but it came out to very little fanfare, didn't get a lot of attention, and probably deservedly so, to be fair. All right. So what does Pentagram do then? Well, there's a longer hiatus. And it's not until, I think, about 7 years later. Yep. There's some compilations here. Now, this is also, though, when those first days here, compilations, and like If the Winds Would Change come out. So there was still interest in the band. But it wouldn't be until 2011 that Pentagram would come bouncing back once again, this time on Metal Blade Records with the album called Last Rites. So, this is sort of, a big triumphant return in a way, because you're, sort of back on a bigger metal label, real distribution. And Bobby's also back working with Victor Griffin again on this one. So you kind of got, the two titans in the band's history reconnecting for the first time in a long time. The band was touring again around this time. Bobby was very clean at this point. This was around the time that I got to see Pentagram live. I only ever got to see him once. It was in, I think, 2010. They were on was it Planet Caravan Doom Festival. And I got to see them in Asheville, North Carolina. They had a good bill. Orange Goblin was one of the headliners, and they're not one of my favorite bands, but they tore it up live. They were a great live band. They also had Gates of Slumber, which was an excellent doom band out of Indiana, I believe, who did several really good albums before unfortunately falling apart. But Pentagram was the headliner, and they stole the show that night. Anytime, again, you bought a ticket to a Pentagram show, you were crossing your fingers that it actually happened. I knew what I was getting into, that it might be a bust, but it wasn't. Bobby was spot on that night. He looked great. He sounded great. He was in the zone. He gave a hell of a performance. I got right up on the rail before the show even started. Nobody moved me off that rail all night. Victor came out and played the encore with them. And I went totally, 13-year-old girl at a K-pop concert, just crazy fan at that point. I lost it. I'll admit, why not? It was glorious. So yeah, the band, was doing pretty well. But with Last Rites, the album itself is not amazing. I'll be honest. It's also Metal Blade pressed it on vinyl. You can get colored vinyl versions of it. Again, it's got some 70s tracks reworked pretty well, like Treat Me Right to open the album with. But it's also got other 70s tracks like Call the Man that were never favorites of mine to begin with. The newer material like 8 and American Dream, they're not bad songs, but they're not instant penta classics either. So you've got some other things on here. I think this has got a pretty good version of Walk in the Blue Light, which is one of their old 70s tracks I dig. Right in the middle, though, they have two really weak ones. Everything's Turning Tonight and Windmill and Chimes. These date way back. If I remember right, Windmill and Chimes is going back almost to like the Stone Bunny era. You should never go back to something named Stone Bunny. There's nothing to recover there. So having those two tracks in the middle of the album really sucks some of the life out of it. It was doing okay here through most of side A, and then you just kind of come way, way down before getting to side B. So yeah, not my favorite Pentagram album personally. The band did one more to date, and that one, let's double check our dates here, make sure we get these right, was, man, they've got a long discography to look through. Yeah, 2015. So it took about another 4 years, but you get their last album, to date anyway, called Curious Volume. Weird cover, never quite got what's up with the bird and the electronics and yeah, whatever. Moving past it, this one again is kind of similar to Last Rites. It's not an amazing album, to be fair. Trying to be somewhat objective here. It's got some good tracks on it, but it's got some weak stuff. And again, it's got some 70s stuff reworked that didn't need to be. It does have some 70s stuff that could be reworked. Suffering, if I remember right, this one goes back to about 1973 and was one of their really strong numbers back then, and is done pretty well here too. So there is some cool stuff on here. But others like Because I Made It, that song's been around for a long time and didn't need to be redone. Some songs just, you can't put lipstick on a pig and make it pretty, as we say here in the South. And some of these older tracks, you can't pretty them up no matter how hard you try. But yeah, this has been the last album Pentagram has put out to date. Now, there is other stuff I haven't shown. There's been some live albums, one legit live album for sure. There's been DVDs of band performances. There was also a documentary about Bobby put out on DVD. It's a pretty hard thing to watch because, it really shows him, the first half of the video really focuses on a period where he was very, much still in the thralls of addiction and dealing with a lot of physical problems and stuff. It's just not a pleasant thing to have to sit through. I watched it once. I may have watched it a second time. I don't plan to go back and watch it again anytime soon. It has kind of a happy ending because it kind of comes to a close there around 2010, 2011 when he's getting, his system cleaned out and establishing some relationships that were more healthy and stuff like that. There's a little bit more to wrapping up the Pentagram story, though. There's been some different side projects that are worth a quick mention. Victor Griffin, of course, famously did the Place of Skulls material, but he also did a little bit of solo material. This one was put out under the name Victor Griffin's Engraved. It's a decent enough recording. I haven't played it in a long time. If I remember right, it was one of the very first things I ever bought through Bandcamp, and that was probably back around 2013, 2014. It came on green vinyl and also black. So yeah, it's Victor Griffin playing some decent songs. I haven't played it in ages, but the solo recording that's more interesting to me is this one called Late for an Early Grave. And this is the kind of thing that typically doesn't appeal to me when you have, a prominent musician goes and puts out sort of, a personal collection. A lot of times those are a little bit throwaway. This one is really good. It's got a lot of different, mostly demo type recordings that Victor did over the years, going back to his early days with Death Row, all the way up through like Be Forewarned and early and mid 90s Pentagram days, and even beyond that. And it's just some cool tunes on here. It's a couple of demo versions of things that ended up on Be Forewarned are on here and sound pretty good. Like there's a demo version of Wolf's Blood and Vampire Love. There's some cool cover songs on here. He does a really good cover of Ain't It Fun, the old Dead Boys track. And I actually like Victor's version more than I like the Dead Boys version. It's really got a nasty little vibe to it, but also kind of a sad, depressive vibe at the same time. It's a very nice cover. There's some other covers too. I'm forgetting what all is on here at this point. But yeah, it's definitely a nice collection to check out if you're a fan of the man's work, which I obviously am. One of the other spin-off projects was called The Demon. And this one goes back to the 70s when Jeff O'Keefe, and the guys were still in the band. And one of their mates, Randy Palmer, kind of worked with the band here and there. He played second guitarist for the band for a little while, as I recall. And The Demon was kind of this side project with Randy and a few of the other guys just doing some recordings for fun. This had Randy Palmer and Jeff O'Keefe and Bobby on vocals, but then Mike Matthews was also in the band with the lineup there. And so again, Randy, famously, didn't really want to make it into like a full-blown band or he never tried to get a record deal or anything like that. He was just like, hey guys, I've got these ideas for songs that I'd kind of like to just make a recording for my own fun. And they're like, yeah, sure, we'll help you with that. And that was sort of the Demon tapes. But in the wake of the success Pentagram saw in the early 2000s with like those Relapse compilations, getting a lot of interest in these old 70s bands revitalized, folks did get the Demon material released too. Now I gotta say, that is one heck of a big sticker on the cover. Don't make your hype sticker cover the entire thing. That's just kind of sad. Let's see what the cover looks like here. Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. Creepy looking kid in creepy looking landscape. Tad cliche, perhaps. But anyway, it's actually a pretty good set of recordings. Randy famously always played it down as being just us goofing around, but it actually sounds pretty good. Folks were pleasantly surprised when they finally got to check this stuff out. It's got a really good set of liner notes in it. Randy, unfortunately, had passed away in an accident years before. So once again, Jeff O'Keefe, steps in and does a really nice job with all the liner notes, very detailed, and paying tribute, to his old buddy. And a few years after that, they did also put out another collection. This one called Child of Darkness, or no, sorry, wrong. Symphony of Shadows. Child of Darkness was the first one. Symphony of Shadows is the second one. And so what happened here was, Jeff had recruited, some other guys to help him finish recording some other material that Randy had written, but they never, got to like a finalized phase on. So kind of, took, Randy's old parts, added vocals to them for the first time, for example, stuff like that. And again, there's a really good set of liner notes in here from Jeff. It's definitely worth, if you're a hardcore Pentagram fan, you want this just for the liner notes, if nothing else. Now, musically, I'll admit up front, it's not the strongest material. It's not as good as the stuff on Child of Darkness, but it's still it's a nice collection and a fitting tribute, for them to pay. No one's going to begrudge him getting, Randy's last recordings finally put out there for folks to hear. And yeah, there's even other, side projects and demos and stuff too. For example, after Pentagram fell apart in the mid 90s, there was a demo that popped up under the name Oppression on another bootleg. And this one has Bobby still working with Victor Griffin, contributed on guitar, but some other guys, including Greg Turley, who's helped out in the more recent Pentagram lineups. He was also, of course, in Place of Skulls. And so they were trying out some tracks even around 1997 to see if there's anything going, but nothing came of these tracks at the time. This bootleg also has a Demon demo attributed to 1988. And I forget what the deal was with the band trying to record some stuff in 88. But it's got Randy Palmer and Jeff O'Keefe and even Greg Main, the original bassist from Pentagram, attributed here too. So yeah, the rabbit hole just keeps going with this band. There's all kinds of stuff out there. I have tons of live shows that I just don't have a physical copy of, but the hard drive has probably, I would guess, at least a dozen or so live shows, especially like the Death Row era, the early 80s and mid 80s of different Pentagram concerts. So you can keep following the stuff, a long, long time if you want to. But I think we followed it long enough for tonight. So let's wrap this up and then let's talk metal in the comments down below. What is your favorite era of Pentagram? Are you a 70s freak? Are you an 80s doomhead? Do you like the newer stuff? Or do you just, like myself, kind of like all of it? What are some of the best songs or best recordings that I didn't give a shout out here tonight? I've shown what I can, but there's a lot of Pentagram material I don't own at this point. I make no claim whatsoever that this is the complete discography. I'm sure it's not even close. So yeah, if there's other cool things from Pentagram or the related members of the Ram family, like the Demon or Oppression, that I should be checking out, by all means, put it in the comments down below and let me know. Always interested in checking out some more stuff. I've been living in that Ram's Head since the mid 90s and I don't plan to evacuate anytime soon. All right, with that, everybody out there, take care. And as always, keep banging your head.